In March 1 of 1896, the hills of Adwa bore witness to an extraordinary chapter in African history, the Battle of Adwa. This seminal clash between the Ethiopian army under Emperor Menelik II and the Italian forces marked not only a decisive military victory, but also a resounding affirmation of African resilience and sovereignty in the face of colonial aggression. As we reflect on this historic event, it becomes evident that Adwa transcends its immediate significance, serving as a timeless symbol of African unity, strength, and independence. At its core, the Battle of Adwa represents the triumph of African forces against European colonial ambitions, a watershed moment that shattered the might of European invincibility and heralded a new dawn of African empowerment. For the first time during the colonial era, an African army decisively defeated a European power, dealing a significant blow to Italy's imperial aspirations in Africa. The victory at Adwa not only safeguarded Ethiopia's sovereignty, but also inspired liberation movements across the continent, igniting the flames of resistance against colonial oppression.
There were actually some areas in Africa that remained untouched by the Portuguese, British, Spanish, French, Belgian, and Italian colonial powers who swarmed the continent with simultaneous goals of expanding their empires. Of the few and far between modern-day states that managed to slip out of the imperial intruder's grasp, though, Ethiopia stands as one of the most impressive.
The valor of Ethiopian soldiers epitomize the indomitable spirit of Africa, a spirit that refuses to yield to foreign subjugation. Despite facing overwhelming odds, Menelik's forces, armed with determination and modern weaponry, stood firm against the Italian onslaught, inflicting a stunning defeat that reverberated far beyond the borders of Ethiopia. The resilience displayed at Adwa became a beacon of hope for oppressed peoples across Africa, galvanizing movements for self-determination and independence. Moreover, the aftermath of Adwa reshaped the geopolitical landscape of Africa, altering the trajectory of colonial expansion and asserting Ethiopia's status as a beacon of African sovereignty. The Treaty of Addis Ababa, signed in the wake of the battle, nullified Italy's claims to protectorate over Ethiopia and affirmed the nation's territorial integrity. Emperor Menelik's diplomatic triumph solidified Ethiopia's position on the global stage, garnering respect and recognition from European powers, a testament to the resilience and diplomatic acumen of African leadership.
In the late 19th century, the European powers were gaining ground on the African continent, occupying one country after another, and by 1885, the scramble for Africa was fully underway, with the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, Spain, and Portugal taking over the entire continent and dividing it among themselves. Italy had invaded Assab port in modern-day Eritrea since 1882, and with British support, Italy took control of the port city of Massawa in 1885. European colonial powers, at the Berlin Conference, then agreed that the newly formed Kingdom of Italy could take over Ethiopia as its colony. The Italians then began to move up along the Horn of Africa, and by 1890, they had established the colony of Eritrea and occupied much of present-day Somalia as well. In 1889, Italians signed a treaty with Ethiopia's emperor, Menelik II, called the Treaty of Uchiali. This was to give Menelik the military strength to take over and merge the Ethiopian kingdoms under his rule. In an attempt to trick Menelik, the treaty was written in two languages, Amharic and Italian. The Italian version recognized Ethiopia as its protectorate, while the Amharic version stated that Ethiopia allowed international diplomacy to be conducted through Italy, by choice. When the differences between the two treaties were noticed, Emperor Menelik pursued to address them through diplomatic means, but he wasn't able to, which led to the emperor formally denouncing the treaty in 1893. It has been reported that, when an Italian diplomat in Ethiopia warned Empress Titu that rejecting Italy's attempt to make Ethiopia its protectorate would potentially cause Italy to lose its dignity, she replied that Ethiopia too must retain its dignity, and that because Italy wants other countries to see Ethiopia as their protege, it would never be. During his rise to power, Menelik had viciously incorporated smaller Ethiopian kingdoms under his rule, where he secured his claim to the title of emperor, taking the name Menelik II, and establishing a new capital, Addis Ababa. Upon hearing about Italy's plan to annex Ethiopia, Emperor Menelik took immediate steps in early 1895 and began preparing to resist any attempt by the Italians to impose dominion militarily by uniting the country's fractious provincial rulers behind him. On September 17, 1895, Emperor Menelik and Empress Titu mobilized an enormous military force of about 100,000 troops, which was composed of Ethiopians from every tribe, culture and community, and began to lead the massive force northwards toward the Italian-occupied territories. The first clash occurred at Ombalagi on December 7, 1895, where the Ethiopian army annihilated a vanguard Italian column. The second encounter was at Mekelle, where the Ethiopians, for 2 weeks, surrounded the Italians who were stationed behind a strong fort, and by implementing Empress Titu's strategy of cutting off the water supply of the fort, they captured and forced them to surrender. The Italians remained in their strongholds and were even considering to retreat, and Emperor Menelik was not in a hurry to attack them, but, on February 25, 1896, the Italian commanding officer, Oreste Baratieri, received a telegram from Italian Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, spurring him into action. The advance took place on the night of 29 February, where the 20,000 Italian troops advanced in 3 columns and fought bravely with their cannons and machine guns before facing a resounding defeat. By the end of March 1, they were in full retreat, leaving behind their artillery and around 3,000 prisoners. Casualties were reported to be severe on both sides. The Battle of Adwa was concluded with Ethiopia's landslide victory over Italy, and the Italian prisoners were brought back to Addis Ababa, where they were treated well and were gradually released. The very fact that an African nation could successfully resist the advancements of a European power caused a serious blow to Italy's reputation amongst its Western peers. Victory at Adwa sealed the unification of Ethiopia and solidified Menelik's claim to the title of emperor, and figures throughout the African diaspora immediately grasped the significance of the battle, Menelik, and an independent Ethiopia. Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, Bob Marley, George Padmore and others drew inspiration from this Ethiopian victory. In the aftermath of the battle, Crispi's government collapsed and Baratieri was put on trial. Less than 50 years after Adwa, Italy was also thrown out of Eritrea, which was restored to Ethiopia. It is for this reason that the Battle of Adwa has remained such a powerful symbol of African resistance to European colonial pursuit, even 125 years after it happened. Ethiopia influenced a lot of African nations into opposing colonialism, and consequently, the Pan-Africanist tricolor was derived from its national flag, which many countries in Africa incorporated into their national flags.
As we commemorate the legacy of Adwa, it's imperative to recognize its enduring relevance in contemporary Africa. In an era marked by persistent challenges and external pressures, Africans continue to seek their own Adwa-era-lying cry for unity, liberation, and self-determination. The spirit of Adwa lives on in the aspirations of African nations striving for economic development, political stability, and cultural preservation amidst the complexities of the modern world. Today, as Africa navigates the complexities of a rapidly changing global landscape, the lessons of Adwa remain as relevant as ever. The battle serves as a poignant reminder of Africa's rich heritage, boundless potential, and unwavering resilience in the face of adversity. It's incumbent upon us to draw inspiration from the courage and determination displayed at Adwa, forging a path towards a future defined by unity, prosperity, and empowerment.
Europe embarked on the age of exploration that eventually led to the almost complete colonization of the African continent and most of the world. Starting with the Portuguese discovery and settlement of the lush and uninhabited island of Madeira, African land fell to European rule one by one. Many African kingdoms resisted with much success for a while. In the 16th century, when the Portuguese arrived on the west coast of Africa, they were met with fierce resistance from the Congo Kingdom, which had a powerful army and a well-organized administration. The Kingdom of Congo was able to fend off the Portuguese for over a century before ultimately succumbing to European domination. In the late 17th century, the Kingdom of Dahomey, located in present-day Benin, fiercely resisted European attempts at colonization. The Dahomey succeeded in fending off multiple French incursions and maintained its independence for over 2 centuries. Further south, in modern-day Angola, the Ndongo Kingdom under the leadership of Queen Nzinga put up a sustained resistance against the Portuguese for over 40 years, inflicting significant losses on their forces. Queen Nzinga was a strategic genius and a charismatic leader who inspired her people to fight fiercely for their freedom and independence. In the early 19th century, the Zulu Kingdom in present-day South Africa, under the leadership of King Shaka, resisted British colonization attempts with great success. The Zulus' highly disciplined and innovative military tactics allowed them to defeat British forces in multiple battles, including the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879, where a Zulu army decimated a British force of nearly. Similarly, in East Africa, the Maasai people resisted European colonization and settlement of their lands for over a century. The Maasai, known for their fierce warrior culture, were able to fend off both British and German colonization attempts through their highly effective guerrilla tactics and strategic alliances with neighboring tribes. And to the west, the Ashanti Empire in present-day Ghana, which waged multiple successful wars against British colonizers throughout the 19th century. These are but a few examples of the many victories of Africans over their would-be colonizers over the centuries. The Europeans were relentless in their pursuit of resources, wealth, and power. Despite these successes, however, the tide of European colonization ultimately proved too strong following the Second Industrial Revolution that started in 1870. By 1884, the scramble for Africa was in full swing with the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. And so, the story of Adwa, a story of resistance, courage, and triumph, began to unfold, a story that still resonates today, more than a century later. In 1868, Ethiopia was left in turmoil following the death of Emperor Tewodros II. The British army, seeking to assert their dominance, ransacked his stronghold and looted priceless treasures and religious artifacts. As if that wasn't enough, they snatched Tewodros's young son and whisked him away to London, never to return to his homeland. With no clear successor to the throne, Ethiopia was left in a state of uncertainty and vulnerability. As the British troops withdraw from Ethiopia, they leave behind a bitter legacy of devastation and loss. Yet despite their destructive mission, the invaders do leave behind a legacy of sorts, a legacy of weaponry. When the British departed in haste, they left behind a significant cache of guns, much to the relief of those who remained in the war-torn country. How did this come to be? It was a matter of diplomacy, of course. On their way to Tewodros's stronghold, the British had passed through the territory of a minor nobleman who was no friend of the emperor. This wily nobleman had demanded a price for allowing the British to cross his lands unharmed, that they would respect Ethiopia's sovereignty and refrain from claiming any of its territory as their own. The British, to their credit, had agreed to this demand, and so the nobleman permitted them to pass. Thus, while Ethiopia had lost much, it had also gained something in return, the means to defend itself against future aggressors. And in gratitude for the safe passage, they left him a regiment's worth of rifles and a battery of artillery, a stockpile that this noble will use to become Emperor Johannes IV, a man who will defend Ethiopia, paving the way for its most famous king Menelik II and his stunning victory at Adwa. During Emperor Johannes IV's 18-year rule, his mission was to unify Ethiopia, much like his predecessor Tewodros II. While he had managed to defend the country against invasions from Egypt, Italy, and Sudan, it was the Italians who posed the greatest threat. You see, in the late 19th century, the scramble for Africa was in full swing. Countries all across Europe were jostling for control over vast swathes of the continent, with each nation looking to expand its territory and secure valuable resources. And with the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, the Horn of Africa was now easily accessible, and the Italians saw Ethiopia as a prime target. The French, meanwhile, had grabbed much of the Somali coast in a bid to possibly threaten British shipping, while the British themselves were looking for an ally in the region. Egypt had also seized a strip of the Eritrean coast in the 1870s, but by 1884, Egypt was bankrupt and effectively run by the British. At this point, the British facilitated a treaty that allowed for the evacuation of Egyptian troops, the return of an Ethiopian city that had been seized by the Egyptians, and the duty-free passage of Ethiopian goods through the biggest coastal port. Emperor Johannes IV, a devout Christian, believed that this treaty signaled a gradual move towards Ethiopia taking control of Eritrea. However, the British had other plans. They saw Italy as an attractive new European power that wanted colonial possessions and was anti-French. The British worried that if Ethiopia were to gain control of Eritrea, they would either let the French operate there or be conquered themselves. So the British switched the strip of land over to Italian control, which ultimately proved to be disastrous for Ethiopia. As Emperor Johannes IV focused on fending off foreign invasions and quelling internal unrest, the Italians continued to expand their territory into Ethiopia from Eritrea. The Ethiopian troops managed to defeat the Italian army at several battles, including the infamous Battle of Dogali in 1887, but Emperor Johannes was too preoccupied to take full advantage of these victories. Unfortunately, his reign was cut short in 1889 when he died fighting against a Sudanese invasion in his north. Menelik II, the king of Shewa province, declared himself emperor following Johannes's death. He had been patiently waiting for this moment, having played the long game for the imperial throne. Menelik II, a shrewd and strategic ruler, had always kept close contact with European leaders, but never trusted their intentions. But he knew he needed allies within Europe if his country was to survive the coming calamities. So when he finally became emperor following the death of Johannes, Menelik wasted no time in signing the Treaty of Wakale with Italy in 1889 in the hopes of securing Ethiopia's boundaries and its right to pass through Eritrea, with the goal of stopping the fighting and establishing long-term peace with the Europeans. However, the Italians had a duplicitous nature, and they had two versions of the treaty. The Amharic version stated that Ethiopia could use the Italian government to conduct foreign relations if it chooses to, but the Italian version said it was obliged to, effectively making Ethiopia an Italian colony. Before the ink was dry, the Italians declared to the other European nations that Ethiopia was now an Italian protectorate, and all relations with Ethiopia must go through them. To most Europeans, Italy was one of the superior European races, and Ethiopia was part of the savage and barbarian continent of Africa, so they readily accepted this declaration. Menelik only discovered the difference between the Amharic and Italian versions of the treaty the next year, when foreign heads of state started returning his letters with apologies, stating that it was illegal to deal with him directly. Apparently, Menelik's translator, Ras Yosef, was working as a double agent for the Italians. Despite this setback, Menelik remained patient and focused on unifying the country. He made no overt attempt to cancel the treaty or cut ties with Italy or any other action that might lead to escalation. Instead, he launched a long and subtle diplomatic campaign against the Italians in their home turf. Ethiopian diplomats got photos of Menelik wearing a giant crucifix printed in newspapers, spreading stories about this amazing king, head of the only Christian country in Africa and a descendant of Solomon. He wrote to many of the European countries establishing diplomatic ties. He used the long-held rivalries between European nations to buy weapons and ammunition. He even wrote to the Italian opposition, gaining some sympathy for his cause. His tactics were so effective that the French, Russians, and even the Italians themselves sold him guns and ammunitions he would later use to defend his country. These tactics of winning favor abroad later became a common tactic in anti-colonial movements. It was especially successful in Russia, which maintained diplomatic contact due to being angry at the Italians for trying to cut them off from a fellow Orthodox government. Menelik's greatest strength, however, lay in his knowledge of his own country and its people. He negotiated and convinced almost all of his nobles to fight for their country. He also launched an extensive counter-espionage campaign, feeding the Italians false information about the state of the Ethiopian nation. He was able to neutralize most of the Italian spies in Ethiopia, while his local allies provided valuable intelligence on Italian movements and plans. Unbeknownst to the Italians, most of their local allies were actually working with Menelik. He used the Italians' overconfidence and underestimation of Ethiopia against them. They consistently misinformed the Italians about the conditions and capacity of the Ethiopian state. They told the Italians that the people were divided along ethnic and tribal lines, playing on their prejudice towards Africans. They told them that national morale was low when it was at its peak. They informed them that grain and food supplies are running out when Menelik was storing huge amount of grain in Wollo. They told the Italians most of the army is deserting as 100,000 strong warriors were marching north. They even told them that they would defect as soon as the battle starts. Then, in 1893, with his control of the country finally secure and securing a promise of military aid from Russia, he denounced the treaty and declared it invalid. Italy escalated, seizing a shipment of Russian rifles. Then, in 1894, it struck deep into northern Ethiopia, seizing 7,000 square miles of territory. The Italians under General Oreste Baratieri stormed in expecting to exploit regional and ethnic divisions, then overwhelm with modern firepower. Why wouldn't they? Every report they'd received was that nobles were deserting Menelik, that the emperor was ill, and that as he rallied his armies, no one came. The Italians even approached the son of Johannes, Ras Mengesha, and offered to back his claim as emperor. They had expected disgruntled rulers like Negus Tekle Haymanot of Gojam and the Sultan of Aussa to join them. But in reality, the Italian invasion had solidified Menelik's hand and created the unity that he'd sought. Even his enemies were joining, realizing this was a fight for independence. The ethnic rivalries between the Tigrians and the Amhara that the Italians were counting on did not prove to be a factor. Menelik was quick to expose the Italians' underlying contempt for all ethnic Africans, regardless of their individual backgrounds. The emperor pointed out the Italians' segregation policies in Eritrea, which applied to all ethnic Africans, not just specific groups. This revelation only served to further unite the Ethiopian people against the Italian invaders, fueling their determination to defend their country and their way of life. In December 1894, Bakhta Hagos led a rebellion against the Italians in Akele Guzai, claiming support of Ras Mengesha. Units of General Oreste Baratieri's army under Major Pietro Toselli crushed the rebellion and killed Bakhta at the Battle of Halai. The Italian army then occupied the Tigrian capital, Dewa. Baratieri suspected that Ras Mengesha would invade Eritrea and met him at the Battle of Koatit in January 1895. The victory in this campaign, along with previous victories against the Sudanese Mahdists, led the Italians to underestimate the difficulties to overcome in a campaign against Menelik. Menelik, on his part, had spent much of the previous 4 years building up a supply of modern weapons and ammunition, acquired from the French, British, and the Italians themselves, as the European colonial powers sought to keep each other's North African aspirations in check. But as the situation escalated, he was in desperate need of allies. He reached out to France for a treaty of alliance, hoping to secure support against the Italian invasion. However, the French abandoned the emperor in order to secure Italian approval of the Treaty of Bardo. Despite being abandoned by all European nations in the face of the Italian invasion, Menelik did have one European ally, Russia. In 1895, a year before the war, Menelik sent his first delegation to Russia, headed by Fitarari Damtu. The newspapers in St. Petersburg wrote, "Along with the expedition, Menelik II sent his diplomatic mission to Russia, including his princes and his bishop." Many citizens of the capital came to meet the train that brought Fitarari Damtu and other members of the delegation to St. Petersburg. On the eve of war, an agreement providing military help for Ethiopia was concluded. As tensions with the Italians reached a boiling point, Emperor Menelik knew that he needed to act fast. On September 17, 1895, he issued a proclamation that would go down in history as one of the shortest and most powerful declarations of war ever recorded. With unwavering resolve, the emperor called upon the men of Shiwa to join his army at Ware Ilu. Ethiopians could not keep large numbers of troops in the field much longer. Baratieri also didn't know the true numerical strength of the Ethiopian army he faced, so he further fortified his positions in the Tigray instead of advancing. He tried to outlast Menelik, knowing that such a big army couldn't remain in the field indefinitely. But Baratieri had issues with his unit. You see, the Kingdom of Italy had only unified in 1871. It was all of 24 years old at the time, and many of Baratieri's officers had strong regional feelings, disliking him as growing up near Austria. Also, the faltering Italian government was pushing for a big victory overseas to stoke nationalist pride. So, the Italian government ordered Baratieri to attack. Finally, on March 1st, 1896, the Italian forces made their move. Against his better judgment, Baratieri ordered his troops to march towards Menelik's camp in the pre-dawn hours. He was misinformed that the Ethiopians would be attending church and would not fight on the Sabbath. But the Italians were in for a rude awakening. They were hit by wave after wave of attacks and soon realized they were facing an army of 100,000 strong, 10 times their size. The Ethiopians, fueled by their determination to defend their homeland, launched fierce attacks that pinned the Italian units down. But the Italians, using heavy artillery, repulsed the attacks time and again. Ethiopian forces began hesitating, including Empress Tetu's personal artillery unit. She approached the faltering troops on foot and drew back her veil, both things that were never done, mind you, and proceeded to shout them back to their guns. Soon, other women had joined her encouragement and taunting, their manhood challenged. No one dared retreat. When Menelik released his reserve of 25,000 men, the Italian brigade was completely. When the 2nd Italian brigade came to the aid of the 1st, Menelik drove between them, splitting the Italian force. When the relief brigade retreated into a canyon, Ethiopian cavalry rode them down. And by noon, Ethiopian forces had flanked and destroyed both the 3rd column and the reserve brigade. Both sides had taken heavy casualties, but of the 10,000 Italians that took the field, only 3,000 survived. Adwa was a crushing defeat and effectively ended the war. Within the year, Italy would sign a treaty formally recognizing Ethiopian independence, and the other states of Europe followed. Others saw that victory as well. Other Africans and black people across the world would look to the Battle of Adwa as inspiration and a source of pride. For not only did it show that colonial control of Africa wasn't inevitable, it proved that European claims of racial superiority were untrue. The Battle of Adwa was a turning point in the history of Ethiopia and a testament to the power of determination and unity in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. The year 1896 was a crucial year for Europe as a whole, and for Italy in particular. In that year, Italy was defeated by Ethiopia at the Battle of Adwa, signaling the end of the might is right era assumed by the European powers of the day. After the battle, Ethiopia acquired a special importance in the eyes of Africans and black people all over the world alike, as the only surviving African state that successfully defeated a European colonial power in open battle. Ethiopia became emblematic of African valor and resistance, the bastion of prestige and hope to thousands of Africans who were experiencing the full shock of European conquest and were beginning to search for an answer to the myth of African and black inferiority. The defeat of Italy in Adwa forced them to recognize the African nation of Ethiopia as an equal and brought Italy's government to its knees, who had viewed them as an inferior barbaric race. Not surprisingly, some European artists rushed to the defense of colonialism. French artist Charles Leandre painted the caricature of Menelik that you are seeing. At the top right, the artist wrote, "The benevolent Negus takes advantage of the victory, but he never abuses it." The underlying message, of course, is that the beastly and barbarian king is going to shame Europe. In the aftermath of the war, Pope Leo XIII and King Menelik exchanged letters to effect the release of Italian prisoners of war, and the Vatican turned to the Church of Alexandria for help with mediation. Trade cards of the day reflect current event in brightly colored images. Here we see Monsignor Macaire of the Vicar of the Egyptian Coptic Church approaching Emperor Menelik on behalf of the Pope of Rome, a prudent example of religious diplomacy since the King of Kings and Monsignor Macaire both belong to the Orthodox faith. Negotiations between the two dignitaries bore results. On November 20th, 1896, the Emperor released 200 Italian POWs in honor of the Queen of Italy's birthday, and successive releases were effected in February and June of 1897, when the last of the Italian POWs left the country. Indeed, in later decades, Ethiopia would become a center for other African post-colonial movements seeking independence. First centuries, Ethiopia stood alone in Africa looking to Europe for allies, but by the dawn of the 20th century, it had become a leader among fellow African states in the struggle against Europe. The Battle of Adwa was the first defeat of a European power by an African army in modern times. Ethiopia became a symbol of African dignity and resistance. Ali Mazrui. Because of Adwa, Ethiopia became a symbol of African dignity and resistance, and the colors of its flag represented the power, faith, and hope of the African people who fought for their freedom. Today, those same colors are seen as symbols of hope, resilience, and resistance against oppression, and they continue to inspire people around the world.
By the late 19th century, Africa was in the midst of a frenzy known as the Scramble for Africa. European powers, driven by dreams of empire, were carving up the continent like it was a cake. For Italy, relatively new to the game, the Horn of Africa represented its gateway to colonial prestige. In 1889, Italy signed the Treaty of Wuchale with Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia. On the surface, the treaty promised friendship and alliance. However, there were two versions of the treaty, one in Italian and one in Amharic. In the Italian version, Ethiopia was presented as a protectorate under Italian rule, effectively placing Ethiopia under Italian control. Meanwhile, the Amharic version stated no such thing. Instead, it upheld Ethiopia's sovereignty with terms that merely indicated cooperation and friendship. When Menelik discovered the deceit, a confrontation became inevitable. This was more than a clash of armies. It was a battle for identity, dignity, and the right to remain independent in a rapidly changing world. Menelik did not hesitate. He called for mobilization, uniting Ethiopia's often fragmented regional forces under one banner. From the highlands to the arid plains, warriors rallied to defend their nation. Menelik's resolve and vision set the stage for the war to come. General Oreste Baratieri was a seasoned officer, tasked with expanding Italy's colonial ambitions. Baratieri had seen success in other campaigns, which led to his appointment as governor of Italy's East African territories. Yet Ethiopia presented a different challenge altogether. Baratieri was initially reluctant to engage in direct conflict with Menelik's forces, understanding the difficulty of the task ahead. Despite his hesitation, he was pushed by political pressure from Rome to deliver a swift victory, securing Italy's colonial foothold. This pressure led him into conflict, despite his reservations, setting the stage for the confrontation at Adwa. The night before the battle, tension hung thick in the air. On the 29th of February, 1896, General Baratieri finally made his move, leading his brigades into the mountainous terrain around Adwa. His plan was to surprise Menelik's forces, but he was the one who would be caught off guard. The Ethiopian forces, numbering over 100,000, had anticipated his move. They were ready. At dawn, Menelik ordered the attack. The Ethiopian army, divided into 3 main divisions, advanced with precision, surrounding the Italians. The sound of rifle fire echoed through the valleys, mingling with the battle cries of warriors. Ras Makonnen, Ras Alula, and other key generals led their men skillfully, pressing the Italians from all sides. The Italian troops, struggling with difficult terrain and poor communication, quickly fell into disarray. By midday, it was over. Ethiopian forces had overwhelmed the Italians, capturing thousands and killing many more. General Baratieri fled the battlefield, leaving his men to face the dire consequences of his poor judgment. The aftermath of Adwa was profound. Over 6,000 Italian soldiers lay dead, and thousands more were taken prisoner. The news of the defeat sent shockwaves through Italy, leading to the resignation of Prime Minister Francesco Crispi. Italy was forced to recognize Ethiopia's sovereignty in the Treaty of Addis Ababa later that year, a rare and humiliating concession for a European power during the scramble for Africa. For Ethiopia, the victory at Adwa was more than just a military success. It was a declaration to the world. Decades later, under Benito Mussolini's fascist regime, Italy sought to avenge the humiliation of Adwa. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia again, with Rodolfo Graziani leading brutal campaigns marked by atrocities, including the use of chemical weapons and massacres of the Ethiopian people. Graziani, infamous as the Butcher of Ethiopia, embodied the dark drive for vengeance that Mussolini sought. Despite Italy's temporary success during the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, Ethiopian resistance remained strong. Today, Adwa is celebrated in Ethiopia as a symbol of pride, resistance, and the enduring fight for sovereignty. As we reflect on this incredible story, let us remember the power of unity, the importance of leadership, and the courage it takes to defy the odds. Ethiopia's victory at Adwa remains a beacon for all those who fight against oppression.
In honoring the legacy of Adwa, we pay homage to the countless men and women who sacrificed and fought for the freedom and dignity of Africa. Let us heed the call of Adwa to stand united, to defend our sovereignty, and to embrace our collective destiny as a continent of strength, resilience, and hope.